So thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we understand from neuroscience and how this relates to our concept of free will. But first, mostly what I've been interested in is the relationship between the human brain, physical brain, and what some people used to talk about as the metaphysical mind. And starting all the way from the 1600s, people like Descartes asked, where does this sort of metaphysical mind come together with the brain? He suggested in the pineal gland. He wasn't right, but he was starting at least to think about the relationship between the mind and the brain. And then Freud came along, and do you hear that noise? I think that's actually my computer. Is it? So Freud came along, and he started talking about, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the unconscious mind. And he was a neuroscientist, so he said there was definitely a neural basis to the unconscious. He even had this sketch here that he drew that was supposedly the neural basis of repression. So he started to think about this as well, but he didn't have the technology at the time to really be able to probe the brain the way that we're able to now. And I started becoming more interested in the relationship between the unconscious, all these unconscious processes that are occurring in the brain, and the conscious processes, and how the relationship between these two things can result in things like lack of impulse control or compulsive behavior. And why is it that the patients that I see aren't able to control their impulses? And how is this working on a neural level, and how can we help treat it? And what does this all say about free will? How much cognitive control do we really have? What is willpower? And who's doing the willing? To start off, though, just a simple definition of consciousness, simply define it in the way John Searle does. He's a philosopher. Just defines it as it's what goes away when you go into a deep sleepless dream, and it's there when you wake up in the morning. It's very straightforward. It's very simple. It's simply a first-person subjective experience. So I can never get into your head. I don't know that you're conscious. I only know you're conscious because you say you are. You could be lying to me, but I know that I'm conscious, and so it's simply what it feels like to be you, a subjective experience. And in neuroscience, we take a very pragmatic, empirical approach to this, to the study of consciousness. And we assume that it's an emergent property of certain biological systems in the brain, so that it arises out of very specific interactions between neurons and their elements, and consciousness is fully compatible with the laws of physics. It's not that easy to predict from them, but you don't need to come up with any special magical substance in order to explain it. We also think that it's not unique to humans, that animals have some forms of consciousness as well. Similar, we have, because there's a continuity between our evolutionary history, the hardware. If you look at a little square centimeter of a brain from a monkey, it looks very similar to the hardware that we have in humans. And also, they behave very similarly. So if you step on the foot of a cat, for example, it'll yelp as if it's experiencing pain, as if it's having subjective states of awareness. And we also assume that there's an explicit correspondence between any mental event and its neural correlate. So every thought, emotion, feeling, everything is tied to some specific set of neurons firing in the brain. And it's just a question of trying to find these correlates and find out how they're related. So there's a whole field now, which is called the neural correlates of consciousness, which is basically searching for the minimal, necessary set of specific neurons that are firing that is necessary to have a particular percept or an emotion, a feeling. And we know that what you see out there in the world, what's out in the world, doesn't necessarily correlate to what we're seeing in our heads, what we're perceiving. So the real question is, we want to correlate the neural activity to what the person is perceiving, which doesn't, as I said, necessarily correlate with reality. And that's why there's a whole bunch of illusions that people like magicians can use to kind of fool us, to fool our brains. So one question is, what are the boundaries? How much of the brain do you need to identify the neural correlates of consciousness? Do you need the whole brain? Do you need just the cortex? Do you need the subcortex? What specific parts? How much of the brain can you take away and still be conscious? And it also depends on how you define it. So we know that there's something that's called enabling factors. The brain needs to be turned on. So for example, you need what's called the reticular activating system, these sort of brainstem nuclei that bathe the brain in neurotransmitters that turn it on, that excite it. Things like norepinephrine, and that needs to be fully functioning. If you get a small lesion in the brainstem, you're going to knock out consciousness. You also need, we know that acetylcholine is very important, and we know that acetylcholine is very active when people are awake, and also when they're during sleep, when they're in REM sleep, so when they're dreaming, and you're conscious when you're dreaming, but it's not very high when you're in non-REM sleep. And so we know that that acetylcholine is very important to have the brain turned on, and also the intralaminal nucleus of the thalamus, which I won't get into. But basically there's these, once the brain is turned on, so the person is fully awake, they're not in a coma, they're not in a, under anesthesia, in a drug-induced state, then the question is, when you're fully awake, what's going on in your brain when you're conscious of something versus when you're not conscious of it? So awake, but what are you aware of? So you can use these kinds of experiments to look at that. For example, here, this is an illusion. It might or might not work depending on where you're sitting, but if you kind of just stare at, perhaps just stare at that B at the bottom where it says blindness and try to fixate your eyes. And do you see something happening there? I don't know if you'll get the illusion because of the lighting, but do you see that the yellow dots are disappearing? They come in and out of consciousness. So they're there the whole time. They haven't changed, right? But what's changing is in your mind. So this is a nice way to look at what's the physical stimuli is staying exactly the same, but your percept is changing. And we know that mostly that functions of the cerebral cortex are responsible for a large extent for your consciousness. And so something's happening in the cortex, and the question is to try to track which neurons are changing, which kind of activation is changing from when you see it versus when you don't. And so we also know that cognitive tasks that require awareness usually are accompanied by these short-term temporal coalitions of neurons firing in together. So you can almost think of it like a coalition of neurons is like, it's almost like winning an election. So you have a lot of firing going on in the brain, and then you have little moments in time where these sort of a bunch of neurons start to fire together, and that's what comes into consciousness at any given moment. And then they're kind of born or die at a fraction of a second. They can stay longer if you attend to something. You can keep it in consciousness longer. And they seem to be synchronized in the sense that they're firing together, but they're not firing at the same rate, because that would be like having an epileptic seizure, but they're firing in sync. And we think that something about 40 hertz oscillation seems to be the magic kind of range. But if you think about it like an orchestra playing, each neuron is a different person playing an instrument. If they're all playing the same note, right, that wouldn't work. And if they're all tuning up and playing randomly, that's not sort of in sync. But if they're playing one beautiful piece together, they're not playing the same note, but they're all kind of coordinating. And that's what it's like when you have this coalition of neurons. So when I'm seeing and hearing and smelling, it's not like all this information comes to this one place in my brain and then I interpret it. It's all happening at different places in the brain, but because the neurons are kind of firing in a synchronized way, that's how they sort of come together. And that's what's called, this is solving what's called the binding problem. How does everything come together? So that's a little bit about consciousness, but what about the unconscious and how that's motivating our behavior? And we know from a variety of priming studies, I'll mention a few, that the unconscious brain is much more active, purposeful, independent than was once thought, and it can selectively activate our goals and our motivations. And subliminal stimuli is so powerful that it can trigger an appropriate behavioral response even when it's all being processed outside of awareness. And we know this by looking at certain subliminal tasks. For example, we can show this image here. So do you see the hidden message in this? Does anybody raise your hand if you see it? Only a few people. Yeah. Okay, so what's interesting here is that all the information is hitting your retina. It's being processed by the visual parts of your brain. But there's a subtle message here. So if you can see, I don't have a pointer, but in the negative space, it's by the roots, it says SEX. Can you see that? And then you can kind of see there's like birds and bees, and the flowers are gesticulating towards each other. You see? And so what's interesting here is that now once you see it, you can't not see it, right? Something changed in your brain. But the stimuli stayed the same. The physical stimuli hitting your retina, being processed by the brain, was the same. Your perception is what changed. And again, that's what we're trying to understand, is what is changing in your brain when you see it versus when you don't. So there are hundreds of studies now that show that factors that we're unaware of can influence the way that we think. Another example is you can look at a priming effect. So here in this study, they would show either the bad boy throwing the cake or the good boy presenting the cake subliminally. They would present it so quickly that the person would claim they hadn't seen anything. Then they would show the neutral image of a boy after and just tell the subject to describe the boy with adjectives. And sure enough, if they had seen subliminally the bad boy, they would describe him in more negative ways versus if they had seen the good boy. And this isn't just with visual stimuli. Also, you can look at priming effects in terms of using words. So here they would actually show people words, like here for example, bread or truck, and they would mask it by showing these X's right after so that the people would claim they hadn't seen anything. And then their task was simply they'd be presented superliminally, so above the threshold of consciousness, either a word or a non-word, and they had to just say, is it a word or a non-word? And they would measure how fast they could do that. And sure enough, if they had seen the word bread subliminally, they were much quicker to say, for example, sandwich is a word. So they had been primed by the word bread. But the interesting fact here is that it's not just a picture of bread or the way it looks or the way the word bread sounds, it's actually the meaning of the word. So it's just showing that our unconscious is processing things at a much deeper level. We're understanding the semantic meaning of things. This can also be done in other sensory modalities as well. So for example, there are studies that show if you put a lemon cleaning scent in a room while people are doing a task, they're doing an experiment, at the end you give them cookies, they're much more likely to clean up their crumbs after themselves if they have that smell in the room. So you can think of a whole variety of ways in which you can, people can be influenced by the things around them without knowing why. Also tactile information. There was a study that came out by John Barger's group at Yale, where and it came out in Science, which is a very reputable journal, where he would have subjects coming to the lab and they would meet the lab assistant who would take them to the lab, and they were holding a bunch of books and a cup of coffee. And they would say to the subject, oh, can you just hold my coffee while we go to the lab? And either it was a hot cup of coffee or a cold cup of coffee. Then they would get to the lab, the subject would read an essay like describing someone in a very neutral way, and then they would ask to describe that person afterwards. And if they had held the warm cup of coffee, they were more likely to say that the person in the essay was very warm and friendly and whatever. And if they had held the cold cup of coffee, they would say they were more cold or distant. And so they had been primed by the tactile information as well. There are studies that show if you have a briefcase in the room, if somebody's in view of a briefcase, they're more likely to act competitively. Judges are more likely to deny parole if they've gone for a long period without having a break. People who go to polling places that are schools are more likely to vote for taxes that will help fund education. So there's a whole variety of things that affect how we behave, and usually we come up with reasons why we did something after the fact. We confabulate. So for example, a study that was done about free association in the 70s, they gave people word pairs to memorize. For example, one of the pairs, if it was ocean moon. And then after, they would give them a free association task, say, okay, think of any detergent you would like, whatever, and they're much more likely they would say tide if they had had the word ocean moon before. And if you ask them why, they'll say, oh, I like the way it smells, my mom used it as a kid. They'll come up with a variety of reasons why they chose that, then not really realizing they'd been primed to do so. Also, how does this affect our decision making? So there's studies that show, I can't go into all of them, but basically that our unconscious decision making seems to be the best way to go. So in this one study that came out in Science, they basically had people, gave them a bunch of variables about buying things, so either a car or something very simple like an oven mitt. And then they either let them think about their decision and then decide, or they had them solve anagrams and they weren't allowed to decide. They called this deliberation without attention. So, think about something else, don't think about it, and then make your decision. And what they found is that with simple choices, like whether to buy a certain towel or an oven mitt, they made better choices, and choices were measured by post-decisional satisfaction. They were more satisfied with their choices when they could think consciously about it. But when the choice was about something that was more complex, like buying a house or a car, they actually made better decisions when they weren't allowed to think about it. I mean, they took in all the variables and they set it aside, solved these anagrams, and then had to decide using sort of their gut, so to speak. And what this is saying is basically consciousness has a limited capacity. So it follows certain rules. You can say, okay, I don't want to go past a certain price, or I want a certain color. But after a certain point, when many variables are involved, it's almost too much for the consciousness to handle. And the unconscious has a much larger capacity. So when people, it's doing some sort of very complex processing. When they say sleep on it and whatever and follow your gut, that's really follow your emotion, or I would say, follow what your unconscious or subcortical brain is telling you to do. And it seems that seems to be better for more complex decisions. And there's a whole variety of studies which show, again, that unconscious brain makes better decisions, that distraction can facilitate creative problem solving. Trusting your instincts can lead to the right answer. And also unconscious brain activity predicts a moment of insight. So they gave people riddles, and then they did MEG as a way to measure brain activation, and they found they could predict just before the person was about to solve the riddle based on their brain activation. So in a sense, your brain is doing the work, but you don't necessarily, the conscious you doesn't really have to be aware of it. And sometimes consciousness gets in the way. And we know this also from people who are, professional sports players. If, they train, and eventually it becomes implicit. And then if you start to think about it consciously, you can mess up the behavior. So what's happening at the neural basis, there are some studies that look at what's happening when you're being motivated, let's say, for example, towards money, and what's happening in the brain. And here they did an interesting study where they would show people either a pound or a penny, and they would mask it on either side so that the person, in certain cases, would say they didn't see anything. And in certain, when they were presented for 100 milliseconds, they would see it, but when they presented it for 17 or 50 milliseconds, they claimed they didn't see anything. And all they had to do was squeeze this grip, and the harder they squeezed this grip, this little bar would go up, and the more of the money they could win. So sure enough, when they saw the pound, they squeezed harder than when they saw the penny consciously. But they were told to squeeze either way, even if they only saw the mask. And when they saw the subliminal pound, they also squeezed harder for the subliminally presented pound than the penny. And then when they looked at this while they were doing this task in the scanner, they were doing fMRI, where you could look at basically the blood activation in different parts of the brain. The results were that whether they saw it, the money, or didn't see it, a part of the brain was activated when the money was presented called the ventral pallidum, which is part of the basal ganglia, which is a sort of evolutionarily older part of the brain. It's a subcortical part of the brain. It seems to operate outside of awareness. And this part of the brain was active when the money was presented, either consciously or unconsciously, and it suggests that there might be a sort of bottom-up decision-making process where this part of the ventral pallidum of the brain is a circuit that first weighs rewards and punishers, and then decides, and then only later interacts with higher level parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex. So consciousness sometimes is the last thing to know about a decision that's being made. And if you're interested in these kinds of studies that look at the unconscious motivation or unconscious will, there's a nice review paper in Science on this. So in a similar study, I started looking at people who have these impulse control problems, people like with pathological gambling, for example. Why can't they control their impulses even though they keep losing money? Or drug addicts, even though they're losing everything, but they can't seem to stop themselves. And I found that we did a study called the monetary incentive delay task, where we would tell them they're either going to win or lose $5 or win or gain nothing. Then we had them wait for a period of time, and then they had to press a button. And what we're interested in is in that anticipation period, the period in which they were waiting to get the reward or the punisher, anticipating getting it. We looked at pathological gamblers compared to healthy controls, and found actually that when you looked at the reward condition versus neutral, so when they're anticipating getting a reward versus not getting anything, in pathological gamblers compared to healthies, they had decreased activation in the ventral striatum, which is that same part of the brain. It's like the reward center of the brain, the same part I was saying that was active in that other study where they saw the pound. They had decreased activation. So what it seems to be is that they seem to be chronically understimulated. They're actually not, it used to be thought of that they're seeking out a reward or high, but it seems to be that they're understimulated and they need more just to feel normal. And you can think about that with drug addicts as well. They get habituated to the drug and then they need the drugs just to feel normal. And it seems to be that's what's happening. But these are all processes that are occurring at the subcortical level, the unconscious level. So what does this say for the idea of willpower? So it seems to be that there are these two interacting systems in the brain. Roughly speaking, you can have the sort of, well, the coloring is off, but the area that's sort of in blue, the prefrontal cortex, which is you can think of it as a reflexive system, where the ventral medial prefrontal cortex or the orbitofrontal cortex is triggered by long-term goals, by long-term pleasure and pain. And then you have these other areas that are in red, the striatum, the amygdala, these subcortical areas that are activated to immediate reward and pleasure. And so you have this, if you think of it in psychoanalytic terms, you can almost have like these id impulses pushing you forward, these subcortical drives, I want that now, I want that whatever, food now, and then you have the prefrontal cortex saying, oh no, wait, you know, I want to get into that bikini this summer, I want to hold off, I should, you know, control these impulses. But you can imagine now if a person has, say, a lesion in the prefrontal cortex or under activation of the prefrontal cortex, that sort of brake system, then they might not be able to control their impulses. Or if they have, let's say, those subcortical areas, if you think of them like an accelerator, if it's in overdrive, it might override the brake system and they can't control their impulses. So these are the different kinds, an imbalance between these two systems, roughly speaking, tends to be what is involved with these lack of impulse control. There's also dopamine involved. So these areas of the brain that I was talking about are innervated by dopamine. And dopamine is, again, seems to be involved in the reward system of the brain. And if you actually, if you stimulate in rats, you can implant electrodes and they can, it's intracranial self-stimulation. They can press a bar and actually stimulate this dopaminergic network. And they'll choose to press that bar and stimulate it to get a sort of high over food if they're food deprived, over water if they're water deprived, over sex if they're sex deprived, to the point of exhaustion, almost to the point of death. So you can, again, see how strong this drive that is to get that reward. And we know that similar areas of the brain are active when you give people nicotine in the scanner. It activates these subcortical structures like the nucleus accumbens. And then also in cocaine addicts, people who have been abstinent for a very long time, if you simply show them videos of cocaine paraphernalia or videos of nature scenes, just showing them the videos with the cocaine paraphernalia activates, again, these subcortical structures like the amygdala, these emotional centers and the reward centers of the brain. We also know that people, if you put them in a PET scanner and you have them simply imagine an aggressive scenario versus a neutral one, just imagining being aggressive actually decreases activation of the prefrontal cortex, of the brake system. And we know that if you stimulate the prefrontal cortex, whether it be with certain drugs, like certain medications, for example, ADHD is a stimulant, it seems counterintuitive, but you're actually stimulating the brake system. So the prefrontal cortex turns on and can inhibit people. So by stimulating it, you can inhibit impulsive and aggressive behavior. But if there's a lesion or a chemical imbalance, people tend to not be able to control their impulses and act out. And we know also from brain lesion patients, the famous case of Phineas Gage, where he had a metal tamping iron go through his prefrontal cortex when he was working on the railroad, and he had a complete change in personality. He became, from a mild-mannered man, he became very impulsive, aggressive. What was interesting is that it was very specific to personality and impulse control and emotion, but his memory wasn't affected, his intelligence wasn't affected, he had normal sensory processing, but it was just lack of inhibition. And in a more recent case, this was a case of somebody who, in his 40s, started developing pedophilia and was collecting child pornography and was starting to molest his stepdaughter, and he was going to be incarcerated. And they took him in, and he started getting his headaches, and then they took him for a brain scan, and sure enough, they found this big tumor in his right orbitofrontal cortex. They removed the tumor, and the symptoms went away. He was allowed to go back home, and about a year later, the symptoms came back, and sure enough, the tumor had grown back. So it really gets to this point that it's, instead of just looking at correlation, we're getting at causation. But then the problem is, what about the argument that people can use now? Okay, my brain made me do it, right? What about what happens with the legal defense? And what does that mean for our concept of free will? How free are we? What does this mean? So I am going to use the definition of free will as that the classical Cartesian definition, or the libertarian definition, is that you're free if under identical circumstances you could have acted otherwise. And so identical circumstances mean either the same external circumstances as well as the same brain states, the same internal circumstances as well. So if you were placed in exactly the same circumstances, again, including the identical brain state as previously, you could have willed yourself to act otherwise. And this is looking like a dualism, right? There's some ghost in the machine that can then cause you to act in one way versus the other. And I like this as a great example from, if you've ever seen The Matrix, right? You can either choose the blue pill and be in blissful ignorance of an illusion, or the red pill and embrace the sometimes painful truth of reality. Morpheus says to Neo, you take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. So in this case, strong free will would imply that Neo could have chosen the blue pill, even though his desires, his thoughts, his fears, everything in his brain and the environment were exactly the same as the circumstances in which he took the red pill. So this leads to, there's actually 4 possible categories of belief in terms of free will. You can either, depending on whether you believe in physical determinism and whether you believe free will is possible or not. Physical determinism basically just says the future is already fixed. If we have a complete description of the physical state of the world and all of the physical laws of the universe, then from the moment of the Big Bang on, everything is predetermined and it's just sort of carrying itself out. If you think physical determinism is not true, and I'm on that side of the fence, I think that because of things like quantum mechanic randomness and indeterminacy is inherent in matter, that what future takes place is not fully determined. But however, lack of determinism does not entail absence of causation. So Dan Dennett says this really nicely in his book Freedom Evolves, that it's possible for everything to have a necessary cause, even while indeterminism is true, and the future is open, because a necessary cause does not lead to a single inevitable effect. So there's basically, the future is based on different possibilities rather than it being fixed. There's probabilities of things happening. And I would say that sort of most neuroscientists are in that kind of bottom left corner, and most philosophers are kind of compatibilists in the top right corner, and the general public tends to be libertarianism. So they think physical determinism is false and free will is possible. I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm just going to stick to the data. And I'm just going to talk I cannot talk about free will without talking about this classic experiment by Benjamin Libet. Has anybody heard of this? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, yeah, it's a pretty well-known experiment, but basically what he did was he wanted to measure the time when a subject became consciously aware of a decision to simply move their finger. He just said, move your finger whenever you feel like it, and let me know when you had the conscious, when you knew at the moment you wanted to move your finger. And so the subject was asked to note the position of this moving dot on this clock when he was aware of the conscious decision to move his finger. And although the conscious awareness of the decision, as you can see here, preceded the actual action by about 200 milliseconds, he measured brain activation using EEG, so you're looking at electrical potential, but he found that there was this what's called the readiness potential, this rise in brain activation leading up to the point where the person is consciously aware of their intent to make the move. And so the subject showed an unconscious activity to flex about 350 milliseconds before they reported their conscious will of the intention. So this means, and the part of the brain where this readiness potential actually originated was called the supplementary motor area. Wait, let me go back. Hold on. Yeah, it was called the supplementary motor area of the brain, and that's sort of the part of the brain that is involved in motor preparation. So the brain seemed to have made the unconscious decision to move the finger before the subject was aware of having made the decision to do so. And so what we think of our will as manifested by our own conscious thoughts may just actually be an afterthought. So the brain is sort of building up to make the decision. It hits a point where you feel, oh, I have the desire to move my finger, and then you make the action. We also know this from behavioral studies as well. In this study, the person was asked to simply just grab a light as quickly as they could, and they were able to do that, whichever rod lit up. But on some trials, the rod would switch halfway through their trajectory, and they would really easily just be able to switch and change their direction halfway through. But they only said they were aware of their decision about 300 milliseconds after they already made the move. And we know this from everyday life. You're navigating the streets of New York, you're very easily dodging and moving and changing direction without really having to consciously think about it. Actually, much of what we do is happening outside of awareness. If we had to think about everything, consciousness would be overwhelmed. There are a few recent versions of the Libet study that have been done with using more modern technology. So Benjamin Libet used EEG, which is placing electrodes and just looking at electrical potential in the brain. In a recent study, that caused another great stir was done by John Dylan Haynes' group in Berlin. They used functional imaging, fMRI, and they found that the outcome of a decision can be encoded in the brain. You can look at brain activity and predict the outcome of the decision. In the prefrontal cortex they looked, and in the parietal cortex, and it was up to 10 seconds before it entered into awareness. So what they did in this study is they had letters being flashed on a screen and in front of the subjects, and the subjects were asked to simply press a button with either their left or their right finger, and they had to remember which letter was flashed on the screen when they felt the urge to actually move the finger. And what they found is the conscious decision to push the button was made about a second before they actually engaged in the act, but the pattern of brain activation could predict the decision up to 10 seconds before. So it was long before the subjects were aware of making the decision. It seems that their brain, again, has already sort of decided. The authors of this study suggest that, that consciousness of a decision is a mere biochemical after effect. In a follow-up study they wanted to look at more complex decision making, so they had subjects had to either add or subtract numbers from the series being presented on a screen, and they could decide whether add or subtract whatever they wanted, and it reflected a more sort of complex, abstract type of decision making that might be more realistic of everyday decision making. And again, they showed the outcome of a free decision to either add or subtract could also be decoded from brain activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortices up to 4 seconds before the person was consciously aware of whether they decided to add or subtract. In another more recent study, Itzhak Fried, who implants electrodes in people's brain as part of a procedure for epileptic surgery, and this is he can record single neurons in humans while they're awake, and it's a much more precise way to look at brain activation than simply looking at fMRI, which just looks at blood flow to different areas of the brain. So for people about to go in for surgery for epilepsy, he recorded over 1,000 individual neurons in 12 people, and he had them perform self-initiated finger movement. Just move your finger whenever you feel like it. And he found that there was activity in individual neurons in the supplementary motor area, again this area that's preparing you for about to make a move, about 1.5 seconds before the subjects made their conscious decision to make a move. And with about 700 milliseconds to go, they could actually predict the timing that the person was going to make the decision with about 80% accuracy. Fried also stimulated neurons directly in the supplementary motor area, and found that when you stimulate these neurons, actually it induced a feeling of the feeling of wanting to move in the subject. They had an urge to move. And Michel Desmargues in France did a similar study where he stimulated neurons in the posterior parietal cortex and made people said, I felt like I wanted to move my foot. So you can actually stimulate the urge to want to move in people. So what does it say about free will? So Libet, the original studies, he got a lot of slack for this, and he tried to save free will by saying, okay, well, we have free won't, the power of the veto. So he suggested that conscious volition is exercised in this form of free won't, in that, if you remember this diagram I showed you, since subjective experience of the conscious will to act preceded the action by about 200 milliseconds here, see that space in between here, he said this leaves about 150 milliseconds to veto the action, for consciousness to veto the action. The last 50 milliseconds, that's already the spinal neurons have been activated and the motion is already going to take place, but within that 150 milliseconds, he said perhaps consciousness can stop it. So conscious will can decide to either allow the volitional process to go to completion and result in the motor act, or it could block it or veto it so no motor act occurs, and that's where we have the power. But it's only logical that the conscious decision to inhibit must also depend on some unconscious brain process, just like the decisions do, right? There's always cause and effect. Nothing just comes out of nowhere. And in fact, a recent study done by Patrick Hagard's group says, he investigated the neural precursors for free decisions to inhibit, and what he found was that the last moment decision to actually inhibit or delay responding also seems to rely on these pre-neural activation that comes on before the person becomes consciously aware that they're going to inhibit. So the results, he said, suggest that free won't may be no more free than free will. So if you're interested in reading more about this, there's been a few books written about the illusion of free will. And the illusion basically is that we're the masters of our own domain, that we're aware of everything we're doing and why we're doing it. Sam Harris recently wrote a book and there's an online debate with him and Dan Dennett where he argues that free will is not only illusion, but it's also an unhelpful illusion. So it prevents us from reaching our full potential. And he bases this on neuroscientific evidence, like I've been talking about. Gazzaniga wrote a book about free will where he talks about split brain patients, where you have patients who, because of to treat epilepsy, they actually cut their corpus callosum, which is the bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, and then you can present information to just the right hemisphere, which is the nonverbal hemisphere, and the person who, the left hemisphere says, oh, I haven't seen anything, you know, but if you present information to the right hemisphere, like stand up or clap or whatever, the person will do it. And you ask them why, and they said, oh, I don't know, and they'll come up with some post hoc explanation. And there's this sort of splitting of consciousness where the brain is acting and the left brain is kind of interpreting why they're acting that way. But again, he got back to this question, should a criminal be held responsible for their actions if they have some sort of brain lesion? You know, can you say my brain made me do it? He says that it's not the right framework in which to talk about the problem, that the issue isn't whether we have free will, but there's no scientific reason not to hold people accountable or responsible for their actions. He wrote an article recently in the Chronicle for Higher Education that says free will is an illusion, but you're still responsible for your actions. And the idea is that punishment can be for rehabilitation or to remove someone who's very harmful from society or as a deterrent, but perhaps not for retribution. So it gets into more philosophical debate, which I'm not going to get into. But the other book I wanted to talk about was Dan Wegner's book on free will, and he talked about studies where you can actually manipulate your sense of agency. So where he'd have people, like for example, a subject would stand with her arms down like this, and then somebody would come from behind her and have his arms in front of her, you know, and she'd be looking in the mirror, so it would look as if they were her hands. And then they were both wearing headphones, and Wegner would give them instructions about whether to move. And what he found was that if he said, for example, clap your hands or snap your fingers, if that instruction came to her before the person behind her made the move, she would have sense of agency, like they were her hands. But if the instruction came after he made the move motion, she didn't get that feeling of agency. So the idea is that you can manipulate your sense of agency with timing. For example, you go into a room, you switch a light on, the light goes on, you think, I did that. But if you go into a room, the light goes on, and then you flip the switch, you're not going to feel that sense of agency. So agency is just another feeling that's instantiated in the brain. A study by Hopwood and Lau's group, they actually manipulated the experienced onset of people's action after the fact. So they use this thing called TMS, where you can actually use magnetic stimulation, and you can kind of, in a sense, knock out a part of the brain for momentarily. And what he did is that he applied TMS over the pre-supplementary motor area. He had people execute a simple, spontaneous action. And with that shift, he could actually shift their perceived feeling of when they initiated the action, either forward or backward in time. It suggests that actually the perceived onset of an intention depends, at least in part, on neural activation that happens after the action has already been executed. If we have time, I'll just show you a really simple clip of what TMS looks like and how you can really easily distract, in this case, language. This is TMS over the left hemisphere, and you can see how it disturbs a person's ability to speak, for example. I don't know if the sound is on. Well, basically, he was starting to speak, and then he started going, like, I think in this one, the other one, he's counting 1, 2, 3, and then they turn on the magnet, and it's just like, and you just can't speak anymore. And you can apply this at different parts of the brain. Now, you can imagine if you put this to your head, for example, if you were about to make an important life decision, and if this device could perhaps influence the way you decide, imagine how powerful your unconscious is when making decisions. So, what about the problem? Some people are trying to save free will. So some studies have shown that we're less likely to behave ethically and kindly if our belief in free will is diminished. One study showed that patients who had their belief in free will diminished were more likely to cheat on a math test. So what they did is they had subjects read different passages. One passage suggested that behavior boils down to the environment and genetic factors, and it's not under personal control, and the other was neutral about what influences behavior. And the ones who had read the deterministic passage were more likely to cheat on this math test that they gave them right after. Another study by Baumeister's group found that people who heard their disbelief in free will actually reduced their helping behavior and increased aggressiveness. So the findings suggest that this debate over free will has societal as well as scientific and theoretical implications, and beliefs really do matter. In fact, I'm speaking to you right now, and you're probably going to go out and be much more aggressive now that I'm telling you that free will does not exist. So what do we do about this problem? Can we save it in some sense? So there's a couple of people who are trying to do that. Dan Dennett does it by, in a sense, redefining free will into something different than the Cartesian version that I've been speaking about. He says that free will is an evolved capacity, its ability to avoid threats and pursue opportunities in accordance with the organism's goals and interests. But so by sort of redefining it, he's trying to kind of protect our feeling of agency. Sally Satel writes an interesting, in her last chapter of her book, Saving Free Will, and actually I'll be on a panel with her tomorrow, and she'd probably be better placed to explain her position on that. And Patricia Churchland has a very interesting way. She said we might not have free will, but that doesn't mean we don't have self-control. And this is how she brings personal responsibility back into it by saying self-control it allows us to make sense of these difficult cases where free will is unhelpful, and that self-control can be useful to apply to other animals. And to quote, she says, what is not illusory is self-control, even though it can vary as a function of age and temperament and habits and sleep and disease and food and many other factors that affect our nervous system. But nonetheless, evolution, by calling out the invariably impulsive, saw to it, by and large, that normal brains have self-control. So perhaps that's one way to measure it. Instead of free will, just measure a person's level of self-control, and if they have the ability to, so if you have someone who's perfectly able to control themselves to sort of, if they're about to go commit a murder and they were able to get on the subway, pay the person, do this, do that, everything in their life, they're able to kind of control their impulses, and then they go and shoot someone in the head, you would say that, well, they had normal self-control, and what they did was, was obviously within their control to do it. So a few final thoughts. I think there's still a lot of things out there that are unknown. We still need to account for these complex dynamics that are occurring between unconscious and conscious thought, as I talked about in the beginning, and how much control we have over that interaction, and how does this relate to our concept of free will and the notion of willpower. And there's a really good book that was written by John Tierney and Roy Baumeister, 2012, called Willpower, which I would recommend. We're also, as I had said, there's a lot of things that are affecting our decisions, all these priming effects that are occurring outside of our awareness, and we still don't quite understand how this works on the neural level. We don't know exactly why or how unconscious drives suddenly become conscious, like Freudian slips, or why conscious drives suddenly become unconscious, like with repression and suppression. And what's the relationship between these sort of unconscious and conscious motivation and drives, and under what circumstances can people override their ability or can they override their urges, their feelings of, I want that piece of chocolate cake, I want that drug, whatever it is. How could they override these hidden urges by force of will? And what's the neural basis of this? And how does the phenomena or how does the feeling of agency occur at the neural level? So, again, I think Patricia Churchland, she's a philosopher at UC San Diego, puts it really nicely. She said, no choice is free unless it's uncaused, as I had said. But the problem is that choices are made by brains, and brains operate causally. That is, they go from one state to the next as a function of the antecedent state. And brains, even though they make decisions, there's no discrete area in the brain or neural network that qualifies as the will, let alone a neural structure that operates in a causal vacuum. Just like, again, to quote The Matrix, you see there is only one constant, one universal, only one truth, causality, action, reaction, cause and effect. And as Churchland says, each of us is a work of art. We're sculpted by evolution and second by experience in the world. And with experience and reflection, one's social perception can mature and also allow us a bit more autonomy, and Aristotle called this wisdom. So even though we don't have free will per se, we have the quality of having experience and knowledge and perhaps good judgment. And the experiments show that at least in the lab, the brain decides well before the mind does, that conscious experience of willing a simple act and the sensation of agency and of authorship is secondary to the actual cause, which is these neural circuits in the brain. And how our decisions are formed and why we choose the way we do is largely opaque to us. But what we can learn from this is perhaps try to better understand our own unconscious motivations and desires and seek to bring our unconscious motivation into consciousness. This is what psychotherapy does a lot of the time, try to understand what's motivating these behaviors you're engaging in, and then perhaps that will allow you to better live more in harmony with your underlying character and your long-term goals. So it's written in the temple of Apollo at Delphi and also in the oracle's kitchen in the Matrix. Strive to know thyself. Thank you.